Okay, so today we're looking at SEMICHA Beis, Sif, Aleph, and Beis. Now, as you already know, I'm sure from learning this week and from our introduction on Sunday, that although there's not a lot of text here, but there's more halacha than there is text. And the reason is, as we're going to see, especially when we come to Sif Beis, it's not very clear as to what exactly the case is. The cases are being discussed in the Shulchan Aruch. And consequently, if you look at all the Noisa Kalim and you get the halacha on cases that are directly discussed in the Shulchan Aruch and things that are not directly discussed in the Shulchan Aruch, depending on which view you take about what the Shulchan Aruch is referring to. So it ends up being much more than the text itself. So what we're going to do today is we're going to stick to our same structure of reading and translating. I'm going to translate it following one interpretation I just found easiest in the language, even though you can change that up. And then once we do that, we'll go to the U'LeMaaseh, how we pass again in each of the cases that come up from the Shulchan Aruch and the commentaries as to how to interpret the Shulchan Aruch. So let's begin. Aleph is pretty straightforward. Chazzarah Basar. Oh, just starting. Beautiful. Come in.
I can't find the books.
There were books left here all week. I don't know if they're yours.
Here in this area?
They were on the table and they're moved.
Yeah, it's probably mine.
And they have one or two more in the office.
Probably mine. You put your name there. I don't know my name in 2 minutes. And I've got another month left.
We just found out, yeah.
Oh, no.
Okay, so let's begin then. So SEMICHA Beis, chapter 92, Dinei im nafal chilul b'derech basar. The laws regarding to milk that falls into a pot of meat. Boy tes ifim, and this includes 9 seifim. Sif Aleph. Kazayas basar, a kazayas of meat. Again, as you noted in our introduction, it doesn't have to be a kazayas specifically, but the kazayas would make it deraisa. But anything less would have the same halacha.
Halacha what?
Sorry?
Same, it would have anything less.
The same halacha, that either you have to have a goy taste it, and about to learn, or 60 to the ratio. So kazayas basar, a drop of meat, a piece of meat, that fell into a pot of milk, that is boiling, that is scalding. That's the right translation. It's hot. How it became hot is not relevant. It's hot. And it's relevant that it's hot, because if it's not hot, then we know the halacha is you can take it out and rinse it. Right? There's no absorption without heat. So if it is hot, a non-Jew will taste the milk. Im Omar, if the guy said, the non-Jew says, Shesh Batam Basar, that he can taste some flavor of meat in the milk, Asura is now forbidden. Again, this goes in the principle of Tam Ki Iker. Of course, if you can identify the piece of meat, then obviously it has to be removed. Of course, we're going to learn in a moment, it has to be removed. But the principle here is a Tam Ki Iker, that wherever the flavor of something goes, it's as if the item is there itself. So you have a milk and you can taste meat. It's as if meat is there, and thus forbidden. So you have to have a goy taste it. In lav, and if the goy cannot taste the meat, even if it's less than 60 to the ratio, if he can't taste it, it's still completely. It's completely permissible. Yeah.
Did we say there's an issue asking the guy?
Sorry.
It's hard to know if the guy's heart is in the right place.
Well, yeah, we're gonna do that. That's gonna come in SEMICHA Ches, if I remember correctly.
On how to ask the guy.
If I remember correctly, SEMICHA Ches. The laws of asking a guy. If has to be speaking nonchalantly. Or SEMICHA Ches is not in this book, but I think it's SEMICHA Ches, if I remember correctly. Yeah, it's in some of SEMICHA Ches. About exactly the limitations of how and when you ask a non-Jew.
So why does it bring up here?
Because now it's telling you the halacha. What happens when a piece of meat falls into milk?
Oh, just telling you to have a good try.
That's halacha, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I feel a pachas b'shishim, even if it's less than 60 to the ratio, it is fine if the guy tells you he doesn't taste any meat. That piece of meat itself, asura, is forbidden because it absorbed hot milk. And obviously there's no 60 to the ratio because it's fallen to a pot that's much bigger than it. Now, when is this all true? When is it true that you can rely on the taste test of the non-Jew? When he immediately or he first removes the piece of meat, before it exfoliates, I think that's the right word, the milk that it earlier had absorbed. Right? So there's a principle in halacha, which it's gonna come up in Malicha. I did the tarid, the miflet loy by polit. A food item can only do one thing at once. It cannot both exfoliate and absorb all at once. It needs time to do one and the other. So, just by the way, this is what the Rebbe would cite to this halacha with respect to salting meat, where you extract the blood, the pores are open, but it doesn't absorb the blood back in because it's busy exfoliating, so it's not going to absorb. The Rebbe would cite this halacha as about shlichus, and why shlichus doesn't affect the shliach. Because if he's busy affecting, he doesn't get affected. If he's not busy affecting, then there's the risk of him, God forbid, being affected. Anyway, so here too, the milk is absorbed in the meat, and the flavor of the meat is in the milk. But then there's a certain amount of time that passes, and now the milk that was in that meat also comes out of the meat. Now that milk that was in the meat that comes out is also usser, because it has flavor of meat that it was absorbed into, and then it goes out, right? So now it's min biminoi, it's a non-kosher item, the milk that was from the meat, in another item that's of the same kind, milk, and you cannot distinguish the flavor anymore. So you can't ask the guy to taste it because it's going to taste milk. The fact that it tastes milk doesn't mean that there isn't any non-kosher milk in there. And this is now non-kosher milk, considering that was in meat and came out. It was in piece of meat fell into the milk, right?
Some non-kosher milk in that.
It's non-kosher because it was absorbed in the meat. That's why it's non-kosher.
The milk.
Correct.
Oh, and now that milk.
No, let's like this. A piece of meat falls into a pot, right? This is my pot, and this is my piece of meat. Yeah, it falls in. Now, if I pull it out, all I have to worry about is there flavor of milk in this milk? Is there flavor of meat in this milk, right? Now, if I left the meat in there long enough, then the milk that it absorbed now comes out too. So now I have to know, is there the flavor of the milk that it absorbed and is now letting out? How can I test that? I can't. And that's when I need 60. That's what the Shulchan Aruch is saying. Because when it's min biminoi, when it's one item inside something else that's of its same kind, min means a kind. Min biminoi, so it's a kind in its own kind, you can't distinguish the flavor.
And that's where you need batal shishim.
And that's unique batal shishim according to the Shulchan Aruch. Otherwise, you can rely on the non-Jew. And even if it's less than shishim, it's fine as long as you don't taste any meat. So what's the point at which this piece of meat now will exfoliate? Is that the right word? I don't know if it's the right word.
They're using the word disgorge.
Disgorge?
Exfoliate also.
If I know exfoliate is usually in association with like skincare. You know, like you want to
You want everything to come out.
yeah, right, but I think it's the right word. Anyway, the Hainu, so at what point is this? When the
Discharge was probably a better.
So again?
Discharge.
Discharge? Let's go with discharge then. Just sounds more right. Okay, so this is only when before the pot cools down from its boiling. So while it's still boiling, then the piece of meat is absorbing the milk. Once it stops boiling, now it's going to let that milk back out. If he hasn't had a chance to remove that piece of meat until such time that now it is discharging the very milk that it earlier absorbed, even if the guy tastes it, and he doesn't taste any meat, also it's still forbidden because the milk that was in the meat and is now in the rest of the pot is indistinguishable from the rest of the taste. And for all we know, in theory, you could taste that milk. And therefore, now you have to have 60. So this gives us an idea, as I mentioned on Sunday, that the idea of 60 to the ratio is not a magical number. It's a question of flavor. It's a question of determining at what point is the original flavor no longer detectable. So if you have a guy to detect it, good, so have him detect it. If you can't have a guy detect it because it's milk and milk, it's non-kosher milk because it entered the meat and now came out, and no one can taste it, so go with 60 to the ratio. And that's our way of determining that the flavor of that little bit of milk is no longer distinguishable. Yeah, clear? All right. Says that I must see later in chapter 98. We do not rely on the taste testing of a non-Jew. You always need 60 to the ratio, and therefore, in the Ramah's view, if a piece of meat falls into milk, you have to have 60 to the ratio of the meat, no matter what. A guy tastes it and says there's no taste of meat. There's a difference. You still need to have 60 to the ratio. Okay, so just a couple of things on this before we get to Sif Beis, which is really the more difficult section here. The piece of meat, even if you had a guy taste it and says, I don't taste any milk, we disregard his view because it's just not possible. There's not some milk in there if it fell into a pot of boiling hot milk. And he's just lying if he doesn't acknowledge it. That's what the Pri Megadim tells us. That's point one. Point two is that we're going to see more of this inside the Ches, but it seems like even many Sephardic authorities will follow the Ramah here, that we don't rely on the tasting of a guy. Interesting to note. But we'll see more of that inside the Ches. Okay, let's go now to Sif Beis. So again, I'm going to read it and translate it and explain it using one version of how to interpret the Shulchan Aruch, and then when it comes to the practical halacha, we'll get to that afterwards. Nafal chalav l'toich chadera shel basar. If a piece of milk falls onto if a little bit of milk falls onto a piece of meat that is partially protruding from a pot. Okay, so there's a stew with lots of items in there, vegetables, beans, barley, whatever you want, and there's meat in there too. And one particular piece of meat is partially protruding out of the stew, and the milk falls on that piece that's protruding from the rest of the stew. So now, in the Shulchan Aruch's view, in the Mechaber's view, you can rely on the taste test. So let the goy taste that piece of meat, upon which the milk fell. If the goy detects no flavor of milk on that meat, everything's fine. If the piece of meat does have a flavor of milk on it, so first of all, that piece of meat is for sure forbidden, obviously. And then I'm going to add, Odidan, following our view, we do not rely on the goy's taste test, but in shishim b'chaticha, you need to have 60 times meat to the amount of milk that fell onto that piece. Otherwise, the entire piece of meat is forbidden. Okay, so if the piece of meat has a little bit of milk on it, if the flavor of milk is there, it's usher. Either the flavor is determined by a goy, or the flavor is determined by less than a ratio of 60, as per Ramah. Yes?
Is the Mechaber saying that, like, in this case, if you have, if you know for sure it's 1 in 60, you're good, you don't have to do the taste test, or is this taste test like a...
Good kasha.
Is this taste
Good
test?
kasha. I know the answer to that question. It's a very good question. I think the answer might lie in the fact that the Shulchan Aruch writes, afilu pachas mishishim, which means if it has more than shishim, you don't have to do that. Good kasha. Very good.
It depends what the item is. If it's
well, assuming this item right here, piece of meat, a piece of milk that fell into whatever.
What happens to the rest of the pot? There's just that piece of meat.
Let's get to that in a second. Okay, good question. I don't know. Okay, so let's go at this. That's as far as a piece of meat goes. So long as
they translate this as the whole pot as the last point that you said
about the from the Ramah.
Yeah.
Okay, but the Ramah is not going to be quite clear because he's gonna say something a little different soon, right? So let's wait on that. I don't. How do they translate the Ramah here?
According to us who do not rely on the non-Jew, we need there to be 60 times the milk in the piece of meat, and if there isn't, the contents of the entire pot is forbidden.
No, okay, that's only conditional to whether he mixed it and covered it. We'll get to that soon. It's not automatic. That would not be automatic, as we'll see. So let's for now assume that only the piece of meat is usher, because we'll get to the rest of the pot in a second. The Ramah is going to make qualifications about that. Okay, so the piece of meat is definitely usher if there's a flavor of milk on it, either because it lacks 60 to the ratio or because the guy tested it. Now, what about the rest of the pot? Now let's estimate the rest of the pot, the rest of the stew. If everything else in the stew, machatichas and the other pieces of meat, vahayarak and the vegetables, vahamarak and the gravy, vatablan and the spices, whatever you're using, if everything combined, so that this entire piece of meat will be echad meshishim 1 to the 60th, ma'akol against everything, then that piece of meat is for sure forbidden. Bashar mut, everything else is permissible. Let's explain this principle. Let's explain this halacha on the principle basis. So we have two principles at play here. One, chanan, this piece of meat, because the flavor of milk is in there, because it's less than 60 to the ratio, because the guy tasted it. This entire piece of meat is treated as a non-kosher item. And therefore, the rest of the pot, this was partially protruding in, right? It was partially protruding in. So let's just assume like this. Let's imagine it like this, right? So you have this thing partially protruding in, yeah? The top from the apple symbol and upward is not in the stew, yeah? The milk fell up top over here, yeah? Here is our liquid. What flavor is going into the rest of the stew? Only meat flavor, actually. Maybe not even milk, but it doesn't even matter, because this entire piece of meat is considered non-kosher, and therefore you have to have 60 to the ratio of the entire piece of meat's possible flavor emission or possible flavor discharge. So you have to have 60 times the ratio of the entire piece of meat in the rest of the stew. Okay, clear? But that's principle one, chanan. Principle two is, again, tam ki'ikr, that the flavor is as if the item is there itself, which is why you have to have 60 nullifying the flavor. But the piece of meat which is not kosher cannot be nullified. You see it, it's right there. That has to be removed. So it's not as if, oh, it's 60 times the amount of piece of meat, so let's just stick the piece of meat in and now we're all good to go. No, you see, you know which piece of meat has the milk in it. It is non-kosher piece of meat because it has absorbed milk in it. You have to get rid of it. You need 60 to the ratio of it to get rid of the flavor it's producing. But it's only the flavor you can nullify by 60, not by the piece of meat itself. The piece of meat must be removed.
We saw with the salting, it's the same.
Correct. With the salt and the blood.
Salt, yeah.
In Tzadik Aleph, right? And the Tzadik Aleph? Yes. Yeah? Who's the end of Kuf Hey? End of Kuf Hey. Yeah.
It's against the.
It's against the flavor. Not just the blood, which is the actual item. Yes, correct. Well, the flavor of the blood that's being produced. Okay, so let's continue now. The Medvar Mamurim, when is this true? That that piece of meat automatically becomes forbidden. And then you have to have 60 to the ratio of that piece of meat. When the pot wasn't stirred, at the beginning, when the milk fell. Because you didn't mix it, you now gave the meat enough time to be rendered chanan. That it itself becomes a forbidden piece, because it spent some time absorbing the milk, and then it became forbidden. If you only mixed it at the end. Right? So now it's too late already. Now that you mixed it, you're mixing in flavor of chanan, you're mixing in piece of meat that itself is not kosher into the rest of your stew. So you have to have 60 to the ratio of that. It's only because you allowed it to sit for a bit before you stirred it. And during that time when you didn't stir it and the milk was just seeping onto that piece of meat that was protruding, it turned into chanan. It's become a non-kosher piece of meat. Right? Likewise, clear? V'loi kisa, and likewise, you didn't cover the pot. Because if you cover the pot right away, the steam and liquid mixes the whole thing together. But if the pot was stirring from the beginning all the way to the end, or as soon as the piece of milk, as soon as the milk fell on the piece of meat, you cover the pot. And it remained covered all the way to the end. Now, this piece of meat never had time to turn into chanan, because it right away mixed into the whole stew, and now you only need 60 to the ratio of the milk, not 60 to the ratio of the piece of meat.
But that piece still have to be taken out? No.
That's going to get to the next section whether we can identify it or not.
Saying if you
But if you can identify it,
mixing it, and then you have to.
If you can identify it, then
It's always the
No,
case.
even that piece is kosher.
Right, that's the only way.
Because that
it
piece
makes
can, yes,
sense.
yes, of course. That piece is kosher because it never absorbed, it doesn't have flavor of milk in it. It does not have flavor of milk in it. If it has flavor of milk in it, then it's hanan.
Exactly.
And then you have to have 60 to the ratio of the whole piece of meat. But the reason why you're getting away with only 60 to the ratio of the milk is because that piece of meat never had time to absorb the flavor of milk. And never had time to become hanan. Clear?
And it's not just enough to, in this case, it's half in, half out. It's not enough to just push it in. You have to actually be constantly stirring.
So according to the Mechaber, to be constantly stirring or cover it right away and it remains covered all the way through.
Because you would think if
I'm not
one of
giving
the
you-
pizza is to cover it, you'd think it'd be enough just to push it inside the sauce.
If you're kasha, so the first one discussed that. And they say unless it's mixed, you can still isolate the flavor of milk from the rest of the stew. But the covering or the mixing will make it unidentifiable at any particular location, and therefore the flavor is spread equally throughout, and that's when it's bottled. But if the flavor is not equally spread throughout, then you can't rely on this principle. Yeah, clear? Yeah, with me? Yeah, with me, Shmuel. Okay. Now, yeah. All right. So the Ramah is not going to be a little bit more lenient. Likewise, imloi near cloud. He didn't mix it at all. Not at the beginning, not the end. And he didn't mix it at all. Nothing was mixed at all. So back to the first scenario, piece, which is why I said that you have to qualify when the Ramah said that everything is us, you have to qualify it here. Because he's going back to the original case. Nothing was mixed, nothing was covered. So you have a piece of meat protruding from the stew, and a little piece of milk, a little bit of milk falls on that piece of meat. If you have 60 in the entire stew against a little bit of milk that fell onto that piece of meat, which is partially protruding, only that piece of meat is forbidden. Everything else is permissible. Which means, if we learn on the simple basic level, the Ramah follows the view that a piece of meat that's partially protruding is treated as if it's fully submerged. Now, if that's the case, why am I making that piece of meat aser? It's a chumrah. It's according to some interpretations. It's a chumrah to make that piece of meat forbidden because you know mamish where the milk fell. But really, I should treat it as if it's submerged in the entire pot, and therefore the entire pot can be used to nullify the little bit of milk. It's much more lenient, clearly. Yeah, we clear? So the Mechaber treated it as if the piece of meat is outside the pot. And if it's outside the pot, if you give it enough time, it's going to become hanan. And then when you mix it into the pot, now you need 60 to the ratio of the whole piece of meat. Ramah says, no, it's partially in. It's considered part of the rest of the stew. So that piece of meat is aser. We're going to be stringent, but the rest of the pot is enough. Can be used to nullify the little bit of milk rather than against the whole piece of meat. Clear? Because it doesn't become hanan considering it's part of the whole stew. Yes? Okay. Additionally, adds the Ramah. Likewise, another second leniency. If you mixed it in right away, or we covered it right away, even though he didn't keep on stirring it the entire time, and he didn't have it covered the entire time, the entire stew can be used to nullify that bit of milk. It's only if you do it right away. And in this way, you can save that piece of meat. So in Ramah's view, right, let's make this clear. In Ramah's view, when a piece of meat is partially protruding outward, the rest of the stew can still be used to nullify it because it's considered as if it's in the stew. But that piece of meat has to be removed because it's not kosher. But if I mixed it right away, even if I stopped later, or I covered it right away, even if I uncovered it later, now I've saved even that piece of meat. Because I further intensified its mixture, and I can't even say that the milk is here, and therefore I have to be machmir and take it out. You don't even need to do that.
This is
Fair?
all like, I guess, like you didn't realize it fell. Are you like mevatel is like a pila here? Or
Big machlekas, and big machlekas in the pasuk allowed to do that.
Yeah.
So in this case, it would seem that you actually can,
Okay.
because in this case, it's a chumrah. In the other cases, maybe not, where you're taking a piece of meat from outside and sticking it in. That maybe not.
Okay.
But if you could do it lechatchila or not, that's a big discussion. We're gonna get that a little bit here in the practical component. Right? Where are we? I start somewhere here. Yeah, you should do it right away. Yeah, do it right away.
Mix it right away.
Yes. Yeah. And the question of Imvatlis Lachatchila comes up and it's discussed. Okay. Okay, so that was case number one, where you had a piece of meat partially protruding in, partially protruding out. The next part is not quite clear, which is Shulchan Aruch, what the case is, and especially as the Rama argues, makes it even less clear, because it would almost seem like the Mechaber and the Rama are talking about two different cases. Now, the reason why this happens is because the Shulchan Aruch is directly quoting the Rambam right now, from beginning, Chenim Nafal till Beshishim, before the Rama is a direct quote from Rambam, right? It says there, I think, Ad Kan Lashon Rambam, right? It's a direct quote from Rambam. Now, it seems, or it's not clear, how we're learning Rambam and what case the Rambam is talking about. Is the meat in the pot? Is it outside the pot? Is it partially in the pot, partially out? This makes it unclear. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to remain consistent and say that we're trying to make the Rambam Chaber consistent, even though in this book right here they don't. They make the Chaber and Rambam not consistent. They're just talking about different cases. But let's just imagine that they are, because it make it easy to read. Okay. The Chenim Nafal, the Torah Chamarak. I'm going to ask someone speaking. No? Okay. The Chenim Nafal, the Torah Chamarak. Likewise, if the milk fell into the actual into the actual mixture, the stew, into the mark is literally soup, but into the stew, into the gravy. Or onto a piece of meat. How do they translate there, a piece of meat? How do they translate it here in the English one here? Where's that piece of meat?
Or the pieces of meat.
Say where they're located.
Fell into the soup of the pot or on the pieces of meat.
Now it's saying where they are.
Yeah.
What? Okay, so we're going to imagine that these pieces of meat are actually outside the stew, not on the side, but they're like if you had one piece of meat partially protruding, the other one lying on top of it.
It's completely outside.
So it's not part of the whole mixture. It's just not in the liquid right now. All right. So now, you don't know which piece of meat it is.
What would it mean if that's the case? What would it mean if it fell into the mara?
So this is the big chiddush here. That even though it fell into liquid, you still have to mix it. So if it fell into a piece of meat that's popping outside, so you're making like a stew, a goulash, but the liquid only goes halfway up. So you have some pieces of meat that are under the liquid and some pieces of meat that are above the liquid. And it fell into one of the pieces of meat that are above the liquid, but you don't know which one it is. Right? So in that case, here you can stir. If you stir right away, you'll save it, because now it becomes part of all the liquid and you nullify it by 60 against a little bit of milk. The chiddush here is that even if it fell directly into the liquid, you have to mix it all together in order to nullify it. Because otherwise you can say, oh, the milk's right there. Once you mix it, now it's in the whole thing into 60 to the ratio.
Does it matter the point?
That would be, if we're learning this chapter, that would be the
chiddush
chiddush.
is also if it fell on the piece that's on top of the piece, because
That's a big chiddush for sure.
The other case was halfway in, so it makes sense that it's part of the whole.
But
more part of
exactly.
the mixture.
But only because you don't know.
We don't know.
Only because you don't know what meat it is.
Does it matter
Right?
which?
This is one, again, this is one interpretation of Mechaber. You can find others, but this is one, just because I want to keep it consistent with the Ramah.
Does it matter if
Yeah.
the point and part of which stew is already or no? All of this?
It's fully cooked. It's just it's hot though.
It's hot. It's fully cooked now.
Yeah, assuming it's fully cooked, it's hot though. Yeah. Okay, so this is again one interpretation.
So just to be clear, you see where it falls onto that piece. You can't.
You can't do that. That's what it would seem if you're taking this interpretation of the Shulchan Aruch. You could be taking other interpretations. But again, we'll get to the practical thing in a second. But just to read the text itself, I'm using this interpretation.
Let's say you have small pieces and the drop fell more than 60 times. You wouldn't say chanan and then that whole piece of meat and the milk.
Depends how quickly you mixed it, which is what the Ramah is going to tell us. Because mixing it has double-edged sword. If you mix it right away, so you didn't allow anything to become chanan, now you for sure can rely on the whole thing. But if you mixed it later, now you just took a piece that's chanan, and now you have to have 60 against the whole piece. So mixing it can ruin it for you. If you didn't mix it right away, to your point, which is what I want to get to in the Ramah, but since you raised it, if you didn't mix it right away, now you let one of the pieces become chanan, mixing it is going to ruin it for you. Because now you have to have 60 against the whole piece of meat.
The whole stew.
The whole stew will have to have 60 against the whole piece of meat because the whole piece of meat became chanan.
Yeah.
If you didn't stir it right away. But if you stir it right away,
It doesn't have time to absorb.
it doesn't have time to become chanan. Now you can use the whole pot. That's the Ramah Shona was telling us here.
They give a time definition or no?
It says miyad. I don't know. We'll see what the Ramah says in a minute. But okay, but again, this is only in this interpretation of the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, so let's read it again. If the piece of milk fell, if the little bit of milk fell directly into the soup, into the liquid, or into pieces of meat that are outside of the liquid, you don't know which one of these pieces it fell onto. Mix the whole entire pot. Here it doesn't say if you mixed it. Go ahead, mix it. Because it's on the soup. It's just a question of this part of the soup might have it, so mix the whole thing together. Actually, Yashavis Arev Hakol, such that everything now gets mixed together. And then if the entire pot now has milk, it's forbidden. Ask the guy to test it for you, or according to us, 60 to the ratio. And if not, mutaris is permissible. Then if you don't have a guy to test it for you, that we can rely on, go by 60 the ratio, which would be their most preferred method anyway. Now, with this interpretation of the Shulchan Aruch, we can now make the Ramah consistent, which says, yeah. And some disagree and say, they're of the view, it's not going to help you to mix the pot. Unless you do it right away, because then you allow it to become chanan. So, if this is the case, then the Machaber would say you can mix it even after some time later. The question is why, but the Machaber would mean that you can mix it even after some time later. And says that no, if you do that, now you're making it, now you allow it to become chanan, and you're mixing it into chanan, you need to have a higher ratio of 60 against the whole piece of meat. Unless you did it right away and didn't allow the piece to become chanan. There? Which means like this. On a very practical level, which this would work according to all views. And this is maybe the most practical thing that ever happened in your kitchen. You don't notice your kid's walking by with a bottle of milk and you're making food and spritz a little bit of drop the milk fell in to your pot from the kid's bottle, right? Or the kid's sucking the bottle next to you and a little spritz comes out, right? Now you're not watching where it's falling. You don't know where it's falling, but it's definitely less than 60 to the entire pot. That's for sure. So you have to know the halacha and mix it right away. Because maybe it fell into one of the pieces, now you run into a chanan problem. And according to the Ramah, you can't mix it anymore. So you have to mix it right away. Following? Because if you don't mix it right away, and it happened to land on a piece of meat, that piece of meat became chanan, and now you have to have 60 to the ratio of the whole piece of meat, and you run into a big problem, and you might have to kasher your pot. Clear?
What's the difference if the meat's submerged in some liquid and the meat's outside?
If the whole thing's inside the liquid, right, then, at least according to the Machaber, you still have to mix it. But in that case, if it goes onto the liquid, then for sure you use the entire pot against the ratio of that little bit of milk. But if it fell into a piece of meat, and that piece of meat became chanan, now you have to have 60 to the ratio of the piece of meat, not just to the milk. So you have to have a much bigger pot to nullify it. Clear?
Yeah, well, miyad, I'm not sure.
Say again?
I'm not sure what miyad means.
He doesn't say what miyad means. Okay, we clear? So this is, again, one reading of the Shulchan Aruch. There are those that read it differently. There are those that read that the Mechaber was talking about where the piece of meat was actually inside, and that's why you can mix it. And the Ramah is talking about where the piece of meat is outside, which means they're not even arguing. They just have different readings of the Rambam. Right? Which, as we'll see in a minute, means that Ramah will agree that if a piece of meat falls onto a liquid, then you may not even need to mix it. Because the mixing is only a problem of avoiding chanan. Follow? Yeah,
Seems to follow the words better, second one.
the second one it does.
Because it's marak or l'chatif.
Correct.
Like as if they're the same.
But then
the
the
same situation.
But then the Mechaber and Ramah are talking about
Right,
across
that's the
odds. Yes. Okay, let's now go through some of the practical stuff. So you really have 3 different cases that are being discussed there. Only 2 are discussed in the Shulchan Aruch. We didn't have 3 cases. The 3 cases are if it fell into the stew itself, if it fell into a piece of meat that's partially in the stew, or if it fell into a piece of meat that's outside of the stew, outside of the liquid. Those are your 3 cases. Falls into the liquid, falls into meat that's partially in the liquid, falls into a piece of meat that's outside the liquid. Those are your 3 different cases. How you learn the Shulchan Aruch, you come to a different conclusion. So let's get to the practical stuff, yeah?
What you just said at the end, though, is that if you, regardless, if you don't know, you just mix. You know, and you know somebody mixes.
Correct. But right away.
Right.
And then you're relying on the Ramah, which, see, this is where you get the lean to the Ramah. Because the Mechaber said you have to mix from the beginning all the way to the end. The Ramah didn't say that. The Ramah said as long as you mix at the beginning, you're good to go. Right? So if a little bit of milk falls from your baby's bottle into the
You
milk,
said that, or you said video?
you right away. Right? He said, what did the Ramah say?
Wasn't like at least do it at the beginning.
Because you have 60.
Okay, it doesn't say whether you should or shouldn't.
But you're saying you have 60 times the mixture, right? So you have 60 times the whole thing, you're sure? So you kind of left.
Say again?
You have 60 times the whole, you at least have the milk that dropped in is less than 1/60th
Of your entire, correct, yeah,
the entire mixture, so you're kind of relying.
correct. Otherwise, you get stuck. Maybe something's becoming Hanan. And then you have to have 60 to the ratio of that piece of meat, and you even know which one it is. Or maybe you do know, and it's even worse. Okay, so let's see. So we're going to go in order of how this guy puts it together. Even though I wouldn't have put it in that order, but that's the order he puts it in, so let's do it. So, case where the meat is outside. Yeah? So the only way for everything to become permissible is if that piece of meat itself has 60 to the ratio of the drop in milk. Right? And if not, then the entire piece of meat is forbidden. Right? Now, the rest of them, now what's with the rest of the stew? The meat is still outside, right? You remember we have our goulash, the liquid only goes halfway up. It fell into a piece of meat that's outside of the liquid, and there's not 60 to the ratio, so that piece of meat has to be taken out to us. What about the rest of the stew? I didn't mix it in. If I mix it in, then I have a real problem. Right? In this case, the mixing in would backfire because the piece of meat outside became Hanan. If I mixed it in, I'd have to have 60 to the ratio of the whole piece of meat. I took it out. What's with the rest of them? What's with the rest of the?
Cut away the piece of stuff.
Oh, all I have to do is any piece of meat that was touching, I have to take off. Contain tila, a removable amount, like you had by the case of grilled stuff on top of each other. Right? There are those who are more stringent and say that you have to have 60 against a piece of milk, against a drop of milk, but not necessarily. But you certainly don't need to have 60 against the entire piece of meat unless you covered it or mixed it, because then you are mixing the whole thing together with your piece that's Hanan. So you want to remove your Hanan, and then anything that touched, remove remove the point of contact.
If you cover it, and we're talking about this case of a piece that's entirely out, if you cover it, it wouldn't be.
When did you cover it? If you covered it right away or mixed it right away, it never had time to become Hanan. Now you can have 60 in the entire pot against a little bit of milk.
Yeah.
But if you didn't remove it right away,
So I'm saying in the case where you covered it, but after.
you let it sit and then covered it.
Yeah, is the problem now against the whole thing? Or
Yes, now the problem is against the whole piece of meat.
Or it's out, even though it's covered.
It's covered, it's considered one big
It's not
mix.
versus the other piece.
No, you have to have 60
Yeah,
against the
okay.
entire piece of meat.
Right.
Unless you covered it right away, then right the covering and mixing is a double-edged sword.
So covering equals submersion.
Covering equals mixing, yes.
Mixing.
Yeah. Okay, clear so far? Right? Now this is only with the Eved, the mixing right away and covering right away. But l'chatchila you shouldn't do it. Even though there are some views that say you could do it l'chatchila. It's machlekes here. Some that say you can't do it l'chatchila. Okay, so that was case number 1 where the piece of meat is above the stew. Yeah? Clear? Case number 2, where it's partially in, partially out. Right? We have the disputes between Tosfos and Rashi, the Ri and Rashi. whether we treat that piece of meat as if it was outside, and therefore chanan, and you have to have 60 to the ratio of the whole piece of meat, or we treat it like it's submerged inward, and therefore you have to have only 60 against from the entire pot against the milk. That's the machlekes in the Rishonim. And what's very unclear is who does Rama passing like and who does Machab passing like. They're not clear on which views they take. So here is the halacha l'maaseh. The halacha l'maaseh is we go stringency according to we take both stringencies, and therefore, if a little bit of milk fell onto a piece of meat that was protruding partially from the stew, you have to have 60 against the entire piece of meat, treating it like those who say that it's chanan. Likewise, even so, when you have if you have 60 against that piece of meat, we still make you take that piece of meat out.
60 in the whole pot again.
60 in the whole pot against that piece of meat, we still make you take that piece of meat out because it might be chanan.
Didn't we say that from the beginning because it's what the
That was the Ramah's mechumra, which maybe this is what the Ramah is saying. Not clear, but let's say this is what the Ramah is saying. Let's say the Ramah is saying he's taking the chumras of both, right? Let's just go with that way. Let's make it that way, yeah? The Ramah is saying, look, I'm going to take the stringency of both views, and therefore I'm going to treat it as if it's completely submerged. Well, it's not really because the Ramah, when he says I'm treating it as if it's completely submerged, and you only need 60 to the ratio of the milk, not 60 to the ratio of the meat. So he does treat it like it's submerged. It's not clear in the Ramah, right? But then he tells you to take the piece of meat out. Not clear. But l'maaseh, again, we're doing chumras of both. Namely, you have to have 60 against the piece of meat and still remove the piece of meat out. Because we're going to treat the meat like it's chanan. L'chumra. But still remove it even if it's 60 to the ratio of the whole milk, of the whole meat.
Unless if you mix it, it's a problem.
Unless you do mamish right away.
But even still, saying
Unless it's mixed right away. Before it had to become chanan. Which again, maybe you shouldn't do l'chatchila either.
not that the chumrah that you can't do, but like you're saying,
Say it again.
not the chumrah is you shouldn't even try to do that. That's what I mean.
No, the chumrah is if you took the view that it's considered like it's outside the pot, right? Then as long as you have 60 to the ratio of the whole piece of meat, everything is mutter, even that piece of meat. Right? Following? If the piece of meat is let's think of this again. If you take the view that's considered outside the pot, then it becomes chanan, and you have to have 60 to the ratio of the whole piece of meat. Right? But if that's the case, then once you have 60 to the ratio of the whole piece of meat, you're good to go on everything.
But he's saying it's stringency nice.
But saying stringency to take both. That we treat it like hanan, but we still have to have 60 to the ratio of the whole piece of meat. So remove the piece of meat plus 60 to the ratio of the piece of meat.
It's something like that, right? So we're being
Something like that. Yeah. Okay, so now whenever the piece of meat itself becomes usher, obviously you have to remove any point of contact in another piece of meat has to be removed as well. What?
That's true. Yeah, meat and milk.
Unless it was mixed right away. Then everything combined. Right? And everything combines, you only need 60 against a piece of milk. Okay, what does it mean when something is partially in, partially out? Partially in, partially out is what it means so long as like the liquid goes up on the side somewhat. So if you only put a little bit of oil to the point that it shouldn't stick to the pan, that's considered more like grilling. But if the even if you're like you're making a pot roast, where the liquid comes up a half an inch, that's already considered partially in, partially out, even though the majority of the meat is out. Okay.
But in this case with the double stringency,
Yeah.
Are we still gonna say? I guess are we gonna say the piece of the usher? The Anna? Are we going to go that far? Are we only going to say it's Aser?
Good Pasha, I don't know.
Okay.
Would it be Aser Banna? Probably. Mitzad the Safik Deraisa. If you go with the view that it's considered outside the relative and it's Chanan, then it's Mamash Aser Deraisa. Right? So if you're taking the stringency, you take the stringency. Okay, so that's for case where it's partially and partially out. We go l'chumra, remove the piece plus 60 against the entire piece. Unless, of course, it was mixed right away, in which case you only need 60 against a little bit of milk because it never had time to become chanan. Yes, right? And again, even if only a little bit of the meat is inside the liquid, it's considered partially and partially out. And finally, if the piece of milk fall directly into the liquid, in which case everything in the pot combines together to go 60 against the piece of milk, against a little bit of milk, obviously, because it's all in the liquid. Okay, now he learns a Shulchan Aruch like I just told you before, that if you have a bunch of pieces of meat that are outside and you don't know which piece it fell onto, then you're allowed to mix it all together. But the Ramah is, you can only do that if it's mixed right away, as we learned. Otherwise, you'll have to have 60 against the entire piece of meat because of Hanan. Okay, and a lot of details. Is it all clear? Any thoughts, comments, questions before we conclude? Got to review it again. This is a lot of detail. I think, yeah, I don't know how they do it here, like in the summaries, if they give all the views on the how to interpret the Shulchan Aruch. I don't know if they do that all, but it's easiest. That's why I did what I just did. It's easiest to stick to one way of reading the Shulchan Aruch and then to keep the halacha separate, because if you get into the weeds of how you learn each line of the Shulchan Aruch, you can be stuck there for a long time. So stick with one reading, whichever one, and then the halachas come out afterwards. Yeah. Okay. Have a wonderful evening, everybody.
And for Sunday, what's the plan?
Sunday we're going back there. We're doing I think it's Dalet Hay, right? What's the next?
You have time for interview?
What's the let's look at the syllabus. Next week is Gimel and Dalet. Next week's gonna be the real Hanan. The Dinim of Hanan are really next week. Okay. Sorry? Yeah.
Aaron, I might not be the best.
Okay, have a good day, everybody. Good evening, everybody.
Study.